Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and if you've never been here before, you're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube page. It's a place for narrative, and that kind of comes in the form of two live streams we do, and this one is called Fireside Fairytales, where we read fairy tales by the fireside. They are real old folklore and fairy tales. They come from a couple of different collections, actually several collections, but tonight's are themed around tragedy and romance, including one of the more strange stories I've ever found, which is saying something, and one that I think is a fairly early example of what is pretty clearly fan fiction. But if you do enjoy this channel, the other thing we do is on Thursday we do ride-along streams where I play solo indie tabletop RPGs with a specific focus towards writing, using them as writing prompts, and chat joins in and helps me with that. If you are not watching live, then you have a great advantage. Down in the description below, there will be timestamps that lets you jump ahead to the beginning of one of the two stories we're reading tonight. The first one is a very strange Icelandic tale that is tragic and it is romantic, but it's maybe not going to make you feel romantic or that as you read it, because it is very unusual in its formation. The second one is a German tale that is pretty blatantly fan fiction of one of the soldiers of Charlemagne, who, well, I won't say more than that. We'll get to it when we get there. That comes to us from at least the 19th century, maybe earlier. And as for me, yes, I still have my cough, and yes, I'm still on my less than satisfactory laptop, so if at some point the stream cuts out, it's because the laptop gave up, and I may have to pause at times to cough. But yeah, if you are here live, though, there's a chat known as the Pillar of Humanity. Actually, it wasn't a name I gave it. Somebody reputable and researcher called it the Pillar of All Humanity. Is my chat room. So if you want to join the Pillar of Humanity, you can jump in over there. In there we have Tammy Morelli, GS, Jump Store, and Zombie Wolf, all coming by for and talking a little bit about Valentine's, because obviously there's some influence on tomorrow being Valentine's. There's some influence in it in my choices. Zombie Wolf says, I recently heard that the chat is a reflection of the YouTuber. So maybe that's why this chat is so wholesome and slightly morbid. Aw. Well, that's kind of you to say. Just making sure. Can't wait to see just how wholesome or tragic this will be. Probably not as, well, not wholesome anyways. But it is tragic, but because old story forms don't do too much to involve you in the characters, like they don't flesh them out that much, I do suspect there will be it will be a little muted compared to some of the more fleshed out versions of tragedy. All right, well, I will do a little introduction and get into the story, but first I'm gonna have a drink of water. And then we will get into what we're going to talk about. Actually, I'm going to set this up with a different story first. All right. In the recent God of War game called God of War Ragnarok, there is a quote that has stuck with me, and it is as follows. The culmination of love is grief, and yet we love despite the inevitable. So to that end, for those that live in awareness of joy's bedfellow of tragedy, these two stories are accounts of tragic love. Exactly why they were told, and told on, more to the point, is for each of us to consider. Myself, you out there in the chat as we go through them. It is not obvious to me what the point of either one is. I don't think they're really moral tales as such. But I do think they both testify to maybe a more existential reality. The fact that love is as much a scar as it is a brand, as it's a kind of lighthouse in your life, even if it leaves you sundered on the rocks. So with that in mind, we're going to read 2 stories about the culmination of love. This first story comes to us from Jon Arnason's Icelandic Legends, his first volume according to my notes, but the volumes get sorted around in different ways over the years, so it depends on the publication. Jon Arnason is not contemporary. This is an older book, and well, we've had a lot of fun reading from it. I won't waste any more time other than to say it's called The Elfin Lover, and it is by far the most unusual tale we have tonight. A certain rich farmer and his wife had 2 daughters, who were named Margaret and Oluf. Margaret was the darling of her parents' heart, and used in the summer to take care of a dairy pasture in the mountains. Just going to slightly turn down the music. For her father and mother always put more trust in her than in anybody else. One evening, what the hell happened? Sorry. There we go. What is it doing? There we go. I know what's happening. Sorry about that. How about I just start this over? We're like a sentence in. The first tale tonight is called The Elfin Lover from Jon Arnason's collection Icelandic Legends. And it is an odd tale of tragedy. A certain rich farmer and his wife had 2 daughters who were named Margaret and Oluf. Margaret was the darling of her parents' heart, and used in the summer to take care of a dairy and pasture in the mountains, for her father and mother always put more trust in her than in anybody else. Now, one summer it happened that while she was sitting milking the ewes, a little boy came to her several evenings in succession, and brought with him a small wooden jug, which he asked her to fill for him with milk. This Margaret always refused to do, and as he still came day after day with the same request, she at last became angry. And one evening threatened him with a good whipping if he ever troubled her again. For, she said, I should think I had plenty to do without giving milks to all the little boys who choose to come with jugs for it. Begone! And at this the child ran back crying to his mother, who was an elf woman, and who lived near the mountain farm, and told her how harshly Margaret had spoken to him. The elf woman was mighty wroth at this, and said, Harsh words shall meet a harsh lot. This shall be Margaret's fate. She shall spend and fritter away everything that comes into her lands, just as lavishly as she has stingily refused to give you milk. She shall try how she likes poverty and loss of trust. And true enough, she certainly did become such a spendthrift that her father and mother soon noticed it, and not caring that she should waste all they had, withdrew her from the mountain pasture and sent Olaf in her stead. When the latter had been there some little time, the same child came to her as she sat out in the evening milking the ewes, and holding out his little porringer, and said, Olaf, my mother sends her love to you, and begs you to give her a little milk for her child. When your sister Margaret was here, I often asked her for some, but she was harsh and said nay, and drove me out of her sight. Well, Olaf was tender-hearted, and willingly gave the boy some milk to drink himself, and filled his jug for him at the same time, telling him to come whenever he liked. Then the boy ran off to his mother and told her how different things were now, and how kindly the girl had spoken to him and treated him. Whereupon the elf woman said, Good words shall have a good reward. This shall be Olaf's fate. All that comes into her hands shall turn to fair luck, and all she has shall increase as many-fold as her kindness to you has been greater than her sister's cruelty. So, for some summers, the boy came often to Olaf for milk. Now, one autumn, her companions in the mountain farm noticed that she was soon to give birth to a child. But being discreet, and moreover loving her well, they kept their discovery from all else. Though they could not help whispering among themselves that the boy who used to beg for milk was just as fond of Olaf herself as of her milk pails, if not more so. One night Olaf was delivered of a child. As soon as it was born, an old man and an old woman, together with the boy who had so often visited Olaf in the mountains, came into the cottage, and taking the child into her arms, went out, after bidding her an affectionate farewell. All this her companions saw, and that the youth often came only the birth and spoke with her, though Olaf fully believed that not only the birth of her child, but also the visits of the elves were unknown to all but herself. Time passed without any new occurrence until Olaf's mother fell into a sickness which was her last. After her mother's death, Olaf took her place in keeping the house, but never seemed quite happy after what happened at the mountain hut. Many fine young fellows wooed and wished to win her, but she said nay to them all, sent them all off without so much as turning her head to look after them. At last one came, to whom Olaf's father, wearied with her eternal refusals, bade her to give herself. For some while she would not listen to him, and at length consented to marry him only on the condition that he would never allow anyone to pass the winter with them until he had first spoken to her and asked her leave to do so. He made her this promise, and they were speedily married, and went to live at the husband's farm, for he was a farmer, well-to-do, which was in the mountains, far from her old home. She had not been there long when her mother-in-law saw that some weight upon Olaf's heart, and that her eyes were often filled with tears, and begged her to tell her the cause of her grief, but Olaf would not be persuaded for a long time, and always put others off with shirking answer. At last, however, it was her mother-in-law who promised never, so long as she lived, to repeat to anyone the truth if Olaf would only tell it to her. So Olaf told it to her, and when she found how the good woman pitied her, and how kind and leal was that heart into which she poured her sorrow, she wondered why she had not trusted her at first. For there is no balm like pity to a wounded soul, however deep the wound, and however long it may have ached in secret. In the 3rd year after Olaf's marriage, but the 12th from the birth of her child in the mountain hut, it happened at autumntide, towards the end of the hay harvest, that a man and a young boy came to the farmer's house and gave him a greeting. He'd never seen them before, but he noticed that they kept their hats slouched down over their brows as if they were unwilling to be known. And when the farmer had returned kindly their salutation, they begged him to allow them to pass the winter in his house. The farmer answered, "It's not my custom to receive strangers thus. It is long since I have done so." But on their becoming more urgent, he said, "I cannot bid you welcome, nor will I send you away, until I've first seen my wife and spoken to her about it." Well, the man answered, "Oh, truly you do well, and it becomes you to let your wife have the upper hand of you. If you send us away, be sure that all your neighbors shall know which of you two is master." Well, their taunt was more than the farmer could bear, so he promised to let them stay with him. Then going into the house, he met Olaf, who said to him, "What men are these?" "I know not," he replied. "They've come to me to ask lodging for the winter, and they urged me to do so, that I promised it to them, and bade them welcome to stay with us." Then Olaf said, "In so doing, you will have broken your promise to me, but some voice in this matter I will have. These men shall not sleep in the house with the rest of the servants, but shall spend the winter in one of the outbuildings." And she left him and went to her own room, weeping. So the farmer made ready one of the outlying buildings, furnishing it with every necessity from the farm, and gave it up as a winter dwelling for the two strangers. But his wife never set a foot inside its door, nor went near it. The man and boy took up their abode there, joining the farmer's family every evening in the family room, as was the custom, but always sitting apart in a dark corner and never speaking unless the farmer first addressed them. Olaf always seemed as if she did not see them, never even once looking at or speaking to them. And thus the winter passed away and spring came. And now it happened one Sunday that the farmer and his wife were going to church in order to take the Holy Communion, having bidden farewell to all their household. And when they were a little way from home, the farmer asked Olaf, "Have you bidden farewell to all at home?" She said, "To all." Then he asked again, "Have you bidden farewell to the strangers also?" "No," she said, "I have not, nor need I. For the whole winter, though I have neither spoken to nor looked at them, how can then I have trespassed against them?" But the farmer was not well pleased at this, and urged her to return and bid the strangers farewell, and the more she refused, the more he waxed wroth, till at length she, seeing that he would be obeyed, said, "Well, I will return, as you have bidden, but for what comes of it blame yourself, not me." And she went, And the farmer waited for her, but she stayed so long away that he turned back after her to see what had delayed her. When he came to the outhouse in which the two strangers lived, he found the door unlatched. And stopping by it to listen if his wife were there, he heard her say these words, "This is the sweetest draught that ever passed my lips from thine." And he waited yet a while to hear if there were more, if more would be said. But no other sound came from the house. And so he went in, and there on the couch lay his wife and the stranger dead. For their hearts had broken from love and sorrow, and over them a young boy stood weeping. And when he asked the lad what this meant and how death had befallen them, he only said, "These are my parents." But his mother told him Olaf's story, for she held herself free from her promise now that Olaf was dead. And the farmer, full of grief, bade the lad welcome to stay with him, and as he had been Olaf's child, so to be his. But from the moment when Olaf and her elfin lover were hidden by the earth, the boy was no more seen. Tammy says, "I really love how Rory uses different voices." Well, thank you very much, Tammy. That's very kind of you to say. Jumpstore says, "Isn't she supposed to be the good woman in the story? Well, at least compared to the other girl. Why is she such a beach now?" That's a good question, because the thing that makes this such a strange story is it explains nothing. It leaves implied that she was impregnated by an elf. I mean, pretty heavily implied, but it never really comes right out and says that. And then it leaves this story implied about how if they see each other again, they will die. And it's possible that there is some more widely recognized lore about this, where it's known that like the elves and humans cannot coexist, and maybe that's part of it. You know, I've read a few stories out of this book, and there's nothing that really pops to mind. Usually elves will, if they want a person, though, they will take the person captive. It is tragic. No one can deny that. But I think its tragedy is undercut by the fact that it's very confusing for how little it explains itself, which is a bit unusual for folklore. Folklore usually over-explains. I mean, it does a little bit there. Something I do appreciate about the Icelandic tales I've read, and it's not the only culture that I see this in, but it is something that I attract to, is what I would call, I mean, I guess the instinct is to call it a more primitive story form just because it's probably an older style, but I don't know if primitive is the right word. It's a different format of narrative where it's mostly just a story of things that happen. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of internal coherence in the sense that it's trying to wrap itself around one theme and make one point with every sentence the way we do in modern writing, which is much more lean and focused. It's more just a tale where, and by the end of it, if you ask what does it mean, they'd be like, it's a thing that happened. Yeah, and I think to some extent that's the way it needs to be taken. I mean, obviously there is meaning to it, but I wouldn't say that it was like the thing that will, if it hasn't entered your head yet, will enter your head. How is this a woman who was blessed? You know, it doesn't seem like her sister fell upon this terrible curse of a broken heart. And maybe that's the point, because there's definitely an angle of like elves being outside of the grace of God and therefore, you know, never quite doing good. But it is interesting because normally you would expect the story to be about how she lived happily ever after because she was nice to the boy, and gave him milk. I mean, it certainly leads you to believe that in the beginning, but she sure didn't. She had the most tragic end. So what good was that blessing? No, I have not heard of that song. Maybe I'll look it up after. But yeah, I mean, as with all things, as GS says here, it leaves it open to the imagination. I think that is one of the beauties of folklore. I think that's why it tends to prompt writers to write, is because it has gaps. I think if you fill too many gaps and you suffocate any space for imagination, which is why I'm not really a fan of obsessive world building, and as much as I do enjoy it now and then, I don't know if that's the best trend, because you kind of want sometimes you just want your audience to fill those gaps with their own dreams. Anyhow, this is not Listen to Rory Ramble stream. That's on Thursdays. Let's get to our next story, which is a more traditional tragedy. It does explain its premise. It does follow the much more traditional formats of tragedy that I would say were set out, I mean, arguably by the Greeks, but I think less the Greeks, because the Greeks are a little more about irony. There's less irony in this, more Shakespearean, which does have ironic tragedy, but is also just tragedy in and of itself. And I think one of the reasons for that is because this is essentially fan fiction, which is something Juergen Hubert, the translator of it, notes in his notes. It is a sort of different rendition of a poem about a knight named Roland, who was supposedly in the 8th century a soldier that went to fight, a French soldier went to fight with Charlemagne. What they call the Saracens, which is just a catch-all term for Islamic people who were in Spain that they were fighting. So that's the context. It is a context of a real history, a story within that real history that probably isn't a true story, but, you know, based on that history. So we get historical fiction that is then, in this story, retold as a sort of romantic tragedy. GS says, I think the first story would make a good movie. Would catch the audience off guard. I think it would make a good, like, art film, like a short film. Because I think if you tried to elaborate too much on it, I think it would lose its strange and eerie quality. I think its surrealism is part of why it's struck me. All right. Our second and last tragic romantic story tonight is The Legend of Rolandseck, which comes to us from the collection Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, which is translated by contemporary translator Juergen Hubert, who you can support by clicking through to the link in the pinned comment below if we're no longer live, and you should, because I really depend on his work and the work of other translators to be able to do the stories that I do. Roland, the manly nephew of Charlemagne, once roamed down the Rhine from Ingelheim in order to see these beautiful regions in the color of spring. And one evening he reached Castle Drachenfels, where he requested a bed for the night and was welcomed with the utmost hospitality. The lord of the castle shook his hand in a friendly manner as if he was an old acquaintance, and his daughter soon fetched wine and bread and filled a beautiful glass chalice with the heraldic sign of the lord of the castle displayed in artful colors. He was strangely moved when the maiden now stood before him in all her beauty and grace and handed him the chalice while reddening chastefully. It's a term that comes up a lot. Don't worry, chastefully. His hand shook when he took the chalice, and his face turned to a glowing red. And then he thought, "This has never occurred to you in front of the enemy, not even beneath the sabers of the Saracens." He quickly regained his countenance and was able to answer the lord of the castle's questions to his satisfaction. But during the entire night, the image of the maiden was before his eyes. He only slept for a few hours. In the morning, when he took his leave, the lord of the castle inquired after his name. Roland was almost ashamed to tell him, for there was a lot of fame attached to it, and the people sang many songs of his deeds. The old knight was quite glad to have such a guest in his house, and asked him to stay for another day. The demure Hildegund made no comment on this, but it might have been apparent that the stranger was not unwelcome to her. Now Roland was glad to stay, and the wings of his love grew so quickly that they grew bold. And soon there was an opportune moment. Roland went into the castle gardens. There he found the maiden as she was sitting beneath an apple tree, and she had folded her hands as if she was praying. There had to be a devout, friendly dream in her soul, as this was evidence in the grace of her mouth and the sensuality of her movements. Roland walked towards her and was initially unable to start a conversation. The beautiful Hildegund saw a rosebud lying on the ground and picked it up, and Roland asked her for it. "Until now," he said, "no sign of a lovely memory adorns my helmet. And when my comrades in arms speak of beauty and virtue of their loved ones, I must cast my eyes down and be silent." Well, the maiden reddened and looked at him in a mixture of surprise and emotion. She made a movement with her hand as if she wanted to give him the rose, but quickly let her arm fall again. Roland pleaded with her so intensely and yet so humbly that she handed the rose to him with the words, "Beauty wanes quickly." Roland now dared to tell of his love, and Hildegund confessed more with gazes than with words that he was not irrelevant to her. They pledged eternal faithfulness to each other, and Roland promised to return to the Rhine immediately after the impending campaigns of the infidels and lead her home as his spouse. The farewells of the lovers were subdued and anguished. They departed from each other with a shake of the hands, and what they might have said to each other was contained in their gazes. From now on, the maiden lived wholly in seclusion, daily waited for news of her beloved. Soon reports of new fame which she had attained arrived, and the boatmen traveling along the Rhine sang of his feats of arms. 1 year had soon passed, and the news of a new peace soon spread everywhere. One evening a knight arrived at the castle and asked for hospitality. He had served in the army of Charlemagne, and Hildegund asked after Roland, not without dark premonition. He fell next to me, answered the knight, covered with fame and wounds. The maiden was unable to utter a single word, and was without tears. She sat there like an image out of marble on a gravestone. After 8 days, she asked her father for permission to take the veil, become a nun, and went into the monastery at Fraunvert Island. The bishop, whose parish included the monastery, was a relative of her house and permitted her to shorten her trial year and take her vows after only 3 months. Some time later, Roland arrived at her father's castle in order to lead her home as a bride, for he had been thought dead on the field of battle, but he had nevertheless regained his senses and recovered from his wounds thanks to attentive care. And when he heard what had occurred, he discarded his weapons and had an hermitage built on the rock, which has been called Rolandseck since. At its bottom, the island of Fraunvert lies within the Rhine, and he then sat there day after day before the entrance of his hermitage, looking down at the monastery where his beloved lived. Early in the morning, when the bell was calling for Mass, he stood up from his bed and went outside to hear the chorus of maidens, and he often believed that he heard the voice of Hildegund. Late at night, when he still saw a lonely light within a cell, he believed that it was Hildegund praying for him. And in this manner, 2 years passed, and his grief already consumed most of his life force. One dreary fall morning, he gazed down at the monastery as usual and saw that a grave was dug up within the churchyard. It seemed to him as if a voice next to him. "It is for Hildegund." He sent a messenger to the monastery and learned that she had expired. And he saw now how she lowered into the cool resting place, and how the eerie requiem was sung, which was the final goodbye of the living from the dead. His pain soon overcame his life, and he was found sitting before his hermitage, rigid and dead, his eyes turned downwards towards the monastery. There you go. Much more classic tragedy. As Zombie Wolf says, hope she didn't take her vows as a nun yet, and yet she had. For those confused, if you take your vows, I think most people know this, but in case you don't, if you took your vows, especially back then, as a nun in a monastery, you were, as they would sometimes say, I don't know how literal they're being about this. I don't think being literal, but effectively you're taking the equivalent of a marriage vow to God, which means it's unbreakable. They're in it now. By going to the monastery, there's no going back. Now, modern times, that doesn't seem to be quite the case, but it certainly was then. And that's why there was usually a year of buffer, but she used her connections to take the vows earlier. Zombie Wolf says I'm Sicilian, so of course I knew this. Yes, I bet a Sicilian would. Um, I think now it would be frowned upon, but back then it was just unbreakable. And on top of that, I don't know how hard it was truly enforced, but in general, men and knights, especially for good reason, in the 8th century, were not allowed anywhere near monasteries and nunneries. Because, I mean, if this is 8th century, it's before codes of honor when knights were mostly thugs. That would just kill nuns and stuff. It's a brutal time. So if they saw someone coming, it would have been a problem. Jumpstore says, so the takeaway is that if you become a nun, you'll probably expire within 2 years. My guess is it's implied that she died of a broken heart, because tragedies love that, as seems to be the case with him. But it definitely has a very... I mean, the formulation isn't all that different from Romeo and Juliet. Now, I won't read it out because, again, it is the... I don't want to remove the details of Juergen's commentary. I think you guys should support his Patreon and get these stories for yourself, and then you can see all his commentary that comes after these. But I do want to mention slightly just the first couple of sentences here from it for anybody who's confused. As he says, this is a clear case of fan fiction. The Roland in this tale is clearly a protagonist of the Song of Roland, a medieval French epic poem about Charlemagne's fights against the Spanish Muslims in the 8th century. So Roland was a figure of repute, and what this person has done, obviously, is instead of in those stories, again according to Juergen, who is trustworthy on these matters, in those stories he does die in the battles. But in this story, they've basically rewritten that ending that they thought he died, but actually he lived and then died of a broken heart over this lady that he had met on the way out to his war. Which is just so 100% fan fiction, isn't it? I mean, we've had this conversation on the show before, that all stories are effectively fan fiction. And that it is in many ways the hotbed of narrative development, despite how scornfully it is treated by the average person. But as we have seen before, fan fiction goes way back. But this is a very direct version of fan fiction, and it is following tropes that you can still find today of famous stories and how people write themselves into them and rewrite their endings to be whatever they wanted to. Zombie Wolf has given us our their obligatory, frankly, daily random fact, which is 50% of all cookies are chocolate chip cookies. Thank you, Zombie Wolf. As we know, we all have our duties in chat, and yours is that. Jumpstore says, not too late to pull a Romeo and Juliet, but seriously, people, what actually did you know about each other to be willing to die of grief after literally just one encounter? Yeah, that's true. I mean, people do seem to seem to die of grief, but usually it's like, your wife of 60 years passes away and then he dies a few years later, or sometimes months later. I've had people in my life where that was effectively the case. They just sort of lost their will to live. But yeah, I mean, once. GS is coming in with some dog trivia. I guess that's GS's duty now. French Bulldog is the #1 dog in the US right now. And Zombie Wolf says, impress your friends with this new knowledge. My friends have never been impressed by my knowledge. I'm sure they're not going to start with chocolate chip cookies. I don't have any notes this week from translators. So I will just say, whatever tomorrow brings, I hope it brings you some form of joy, or at least satisfaction in the sense that tragedy can be its own kind of relief, which is why I chose to read tragic stories this year. If you want some more traditional love stories, you can check out the Fireside Fairytales playlist. There's actually a couple of them, but they're themed around Halloween and Christmas, and they don't have any Christmas stories. Just the main one. And I think probably about 3 or 4 months ago, maybe a bit more, we did do more from this actual section of the book of Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, of more traditional love stories. We've done other tragic love stories, also German ones as well. So you can definitely find more if you want. If you're hankering for something a little less bleak. Tammy says, well, good night, everyone. Tonight was great. Good night, Tammy. Thank you for watching. Love the stories, Rory. Hope your cough gets better soon. I hope so, too. Although I did find out recently, fun fact, chest colds, once they're gone, the cough can last as much as 8 to 15 weeks afterwards. Which just doesn't seem fair. Gio says, happy Valentine's Day, or Galentine's Day, if you guys don't know what that is. Or Palentine's Day, if you do. I like chocolate chip with nuts. Either way, invite love into your heart. I'll keep the fire warm. You folks, have yourself a good sleep.